Nora was a beautiful girl with striking green eyes that resembled a sapphire. She was born into a large family in Kabul, Afghanistan, following 5 brothers. In the culture of this country, being a girl came with many hardships. Being a woman was seen as an unforgivable crime, and social rights and gender equality were at their lowest point. Like thousands of other girls born in this land, Nora was forced to grow up in a traditional and fanatical environment, destined to become the wife of an older man and the mother of young children by her teenage years. In a way, she was condemned to destruction. Education, work, and the ability to choose based on her desires and logic had become an unattainable dream for women. Nora grew up in a humble and old house where she learned the skills of homemaking, sewing, cooking, and childcare well. She learned to read and write from her grandmother and acquired enough knowledge to write and read her own name. Nora's life was limited to fulfilling her family duties. There was no leisure, no time she could spend for herself. Her brothers, from the eldest to the youngest, treated her with every kind of cruelty and bad temper imaginable. This kind of behavior had become normal in Nora's family. Her father mistreated his sons, her brothers mistreated their mother and sister, and her mother passed it all down to Nora. This sick cycle went on in a loop, with Nora, the youngest and weakest member, trapped at the very end. In the height of her teenage years, she was left depressed and anxious, growing weaker by the day. No one saw Nora. It was as if she didn't exist. She was completely unfamiliar with anything resembling love or affection from her family. She had overheard her mother say more than once that neither she nor her husband had ever wanted Nora, and that she was only born because they couldn't bear the sin of aborting her. Nora was too young to fully grasp the meaning of these words, but she understood well enough what it meant to be unwanted. There wasn't a night that passed without her crying herself to sleep. During the day, she would replay the thoughts from the night before, wondering, why did she have to come into a world where there was no place for her? Why was she born into a family where no one cared for her? She ended each day with these 2 questions unanswered. All that remained was an ever-growing sorrow in her heart, accompanied by a deepening bitterness and resentment toward her parents. Years passed, and Nora grew into a mature and exceptionally beautiful young woman. She had just turned 16 last month, though her appearance made her seem older. She was tall, and her chestnut-colored hair cascaded down her back. Her unmatched beauty and graceful presence had become the talk of the neighborhood. Women from nearby homes competed for her father's favor, each hoping to see Nora married to their son. A flood of suitors, young and old, began to line up. Nora's mother suddenly became kind, buying her new and colorful clothes, behavior unlike her usual self. But Nora was perceptive enough to understand the reason behind her mother's occasional shows of attention. No one ever mentioned why these young and old men visited their home. If someone came as a suitor, Nora wasn't allowed to enter the courtyard or the guest room. She wasn't even allowed to stand by the kitchen window. Among the men who proposed marriage, it was Nora's father and brothers who decided whether the man was acceptable or not. Among the various suitors and the extensive calculations of Nora's father and brothers, a man named Muhammad, who was at least 50 years older than Nora, was ultimately chosen as the family's groom. He was a wealthy man with a legal wife and 4 children. One day, while Nora was busy cleaning in the courtyard, someone knocked on the door. Nora opened it to find a woman standing there, around 40 years old, with eyes as dark as the night and a face filled with anger and worry. Nora greeted her warmly and asked whom she was looking for. The woman's chin trembled with fury and distress. It seemed she wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in her throat. With a look of stubbornness, jealousy, and deep hatred, she glanced at Nora. Nora stared in surprise at the woman's tear-filled eyes and asked again whom she was looking for. Suddenly, the woman spat in disdain on Nora's face, immediately pulled up her veil, and left without another word. Nora stood dazed by the doorframe, her expression frozen in shock. She didn't even wipe the dampness from her face. Her mother was shouting, calling out her name, but Nora felt like she was in a different world. The harshness of her mother's voice jolted her back to reality. With a firm slam, she shut the door and retreated to the yard. She sat beside the pond, its surface reflecting the turmoil within her. With water and soap, she began scrubbing her face, her tears mingling with the soap suds as she muttered curses under her breath, not even sure to whom they were directed. Her mother's voice drifted from the porch, filled with disbelief, questioning why Nora was behaving like a madwoman, scrubbing her own skin raw. Nora remained silent, focusing on the rhythm of her scrubbing, until she decided to wash her face one last time before retreating inside. No one had ever spoken to Nora about her future husband. She had never even seen him. Yet, from the hushed conversations of her brothers, she pieced together the unsettling truth. She guessed that the woman who had insulted her so cruelly was Muhammad's legal wife. Curling up like a snake in the corner of her room, she buried her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. She lamented her dismal fate, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her fragile shoulders. Nora had learned to hide her sorrows deep inside. Even if she wanted to share her troubles, there was no one to listen. In childhood, she had made friends with the girl next door, but even that friend was married off to a middle-aged man at the age of 15, against her wishes and by her father's command. Nora was a lonely, defenseless girl, caught in the unrelenting grip of fate. She hadn't experienced life outside her home or the ordinary world of work, but even so, she was a wise, perceptive girl. Without anyone to guide her, she had come to understand that the responsibility for all that happened to her ultimately lay with her alone. While she had no choice in being born or in enduring her family's control, she knew that surrendering to it and accepting every humiliation as her fate was a decision only she could make. Nora stopped crying and stood up, facing the mirror and taking a look at her innocent reflection. Thousands of thoughts flooded her mind all at once, but from among them, she chose one. Dangerous, yet the only path that seemed like an escape. The weight and dread of this decision clouded her vision, made her heart race, and sent a ringing sound through her ears. Suddenly, a loud noise startled her. Nora turned to see her older brother standing behind her, asking her to bring him some tea. She wiped away the traces of her tears and went to the kitchen. While preparing the tea, she could hear her mother and brother talking, but she couldn't make out the words. After a brief pause, she carried the tray into the room. The moment she entered, her brother stopped mid-sentence and gestured for her to sit. Hesitantly, Nora took a seat, a storm brewing inside her, making it hard to breathe. She stole a glance at her mother, but her mother didn't notice, a mysterious smile on her lips. Her brother took a sip of tea, then began to speak. "Get yourself ready for tonight. Remember to behave properly, keep your head down, and be obedient. Mother will tell you everything you need to know. And don't you dare open your mouth or say anything out of line. Protect the family's honor, and whatever we tell you, just say yes." Nora stared in shock at her brother's moving lips, stunned by the words she was hearing. She wanted to say something, but her tongue felt paralyzed. Inside, she was screaming, "Say something, ask a question, don't just stand there." But not a single word escaped her lips. Her brother took a sip of tea, then motioned to their mother to step outside the room with him. Nora stood frozen in place, like the stone statues in the main square of Kabul. She murmured under her breath, "It's over. Tonight, my life will become an eternal hell." A lump formed in her throat and her eyes filled with tears. She bolted out of the room and took refuge in the kitchen. She pressed the corner of her dress to her mouth to muffle her sobs so that her mother and brother wouldn't hear. In those moments, she thought about what way there was to escape from this situation. She had no place to flee to and no one to come to her aid. She was willing to die rather than become the wife of a man who took her father's place and, worse still, whom she felt no affection for. After her brother left, her mother called for her. Nora did not respond. She picked up a piece of bread from the bundle on the table and began to swallow it. Whenever she felt sad or angry, she turned to overeating. Her mother came into the kitchen and, seeing Nora gulping down piece after piece of bread, grabbed her hand and dragged her to the room. She sat Nora on the floor in front of her, full of anger. She said she needed to stop this childish behavior and act like an adult woman. She was no longer a child and had to get married as soon as possible. A wealthy man was seeking her hand and insisted on marrying her. Nora covered her face with her hands and began to cry again. With a trembling voice, she said she didn't want to marry a man she had no feelings for and who was the same age as her father. She wanted to study and work. Her mother sneered and said it was a foolish dream, just as I said. Her father and brothers agreed to this marriage, and she must obey. Everything would be finalized tonight. He is a good man and loves you. He has prepared an independent home for you to live in, where you will be comfortable. So you better not act crazy and, like a good girl, listen to what the elders say. Nora jumped up, her voice firm, saying she would never accept this marriage. If they forced her, she would either take her own life or run away from home. Her mother suddenly grabbed the edge of Nora's dress and pulled so hard that Nora fell to the ground. With a flushed face, her mother pointed a finger in front of Nora's face, her tone menacing as she said, "Watch yourself and listen well. These words must not reach your father and brothers. If they find out you're talking too much, they'll slit your throat in secret tonight and bury you in the corner of this very yard." Nora was crying, but her mother continued her threats, forcing her into silence with harsh words. That night, as planned, the engagement ceremony took place, and Nora was married to Mohammed sooner than expected. A red lace veil was placed over her face. She still didn't know what the man chosen as her husband even looked like. The marriage ceremony was completed swiftly, and Nora's father agreed to her departure from the home. That night felt like 1,000 endless nights to Nora. She wished either her heart would stop beating or the ground beneath her would open up and swallow her whole. She made the journey from her father's house to her husband's home with tears, sighs, and a heart full of sorrow. There was no sign of a traditional wedding ceremony, no music, no dancing, no celebration. When they arrived, Mohammed took his new bride's hand and led her inside. Nora stood still, as rigid as dry wood. Her body was cold, and her breaths came in short gasps. Without a word, Mohammed took her hand and guided her to the room. He lifted the veil from her face, placing his hand under her trembling chin. He raised her head and said, "Don't be shy, don't be upset. We're husband and wife now." The poor girl was shaking like a leaf, her eyes squeezed shut. Mohammed said, "Open your eyes, my beautiful bride." Hearing those words, Nora felt dizzy, nearly fainting. She struggled to open her eyes, but her vision was blurred. When her gaze finally fell on the stranger before her, a wave of nausea hit her. Before her stood a 70-year-old man with white hair and beard, lustful eyes, and greedy hands covering her delicate face. For a moment, Nora felt as if her soul had left her body. She had never been this close to any man before, and she had no idea what it meant to have a husband, especially one of his age. Mohammed would not let go of Nora's chin with his large, aged hands. He stared into her eyes, and in his lust, he could not take his gaze off her, like a hungry wolf. He took Nora's hand and said, "You are my official wife, and you must be at my disposal like all other women. Now I'm going outside so you can prepare yourself." Then he left, leaving Nora alone. Her legs could no longer support her weight, and she collapsed onto the bed, staring at the wall in front of her. She was experiencing the worst moments of her life. She looked around in hope of finding a way to escape. She went toward the door and turned the doorknob. Mohammed had locked the door from the inside. The world collapsed around her, and her eyes saw nothing. She fell to the ground and leaned against the door. At first, she surrendered, but then remembered she had to save herself no matter what. The only one who could get her out of this nightmare was herself. She was determined not to give in, even if it cost her life. Death was preferable to selling her dignity. Mohammed returned. Nora got up, stepping back. She looked around for something to grab, something she could use to defend herself if he forced her. Before she could react, he opened the door and entered. "Why aren't you ready yet?" he said, taking a few steps closer. Nora kept moving back. "Hurry up, girl. I can't wait any longer," he said. "With those beautiful green eyes, you've worn down my patience." Then he lunged at her. Nora resisted, but Mohammed was a strong old man, and she was no match for his powerful arms. Growing frustrated with her resistance, Mohammed threw her onto the bed and pinned her down, ripping the collar of her dress and grabbing her wrists. Nora pleaded with him, sobbing, begging him by the lives of his children to let her go. He shouted at her to be quiet, to give in, and to stop resisting him. He pressed down harder on Nora's wrists, bending his body over her. Nora held her breath and squeezed her eyes shut. Suddenly, an idea came to her. She opened her eyes and saw a vase on the table next to the bed. The weight of the man's large frame crushed her exhausted body. She tried to pull her hands free from his ruthless grip, but she couldn't. Drawing on her feminine instincts, she went limp, pretending to surrender, hoping it might make him back off. Sensing her submission, Mohammed relaxed slightly. In a calm tone, Nora said she agreed, and that if he got off her, she would take the lead herself. Falling for her trick, he lifted himself off her and released her wrists. Nora distracted him by slowly drawing attention to herself, while her right hand inched toward the vase. The man's eyes widened as he stared at her small, delicate figure, his gaze fixed on her, but her speed and accuracy mattered most in this moment. In one swift, sharp motion, she grabbed the vase and struck it hard against his head, precisely where she needed to. Mohammed collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from his head. Stunned, almost disbelieving at what she had done, Nora rose from the bed and ran to the door, not hesitating for a second. Luckily, it was late, and the streets were quiet. She was terrified, still in shock from what she had done, but she kept running, from the alley to the street and from one street to the next. She was lost, confused and distraught, shivering from the cold, weakened by hunger and thirst. She took to the dark, empty street, heading toward nowhere. She didn't know where she was or where she was going. Only one thing was certain: she would never go back home.